The cold came first, a particular kind of cold that lived in stone halls, the kind that seeped through wool and settled into bone, no matter how many fires burned in the grates. It smelled of tallow and old rushes, and something beneath both of those things, something mineral and ancient, like the mountain itself was breathing through the mortar. Mara felt it the moment she crossed the threshold of Ashvale Keep. She had expected to feel something else. She had spent the 3-day journey from her father's estate, rehearsing what she would feel. Composure, maybe, or the particular species of resignation that she had watched her mother perfect over decades of being an afterthought in her own marriage. She had packed that resignation carefully, like a good traveling dress, folded and smoothed and ready to be worn. Instead, she felt the cold. And beneath the cold, humiliation, but that had arrived earlier, back in the village square, where the iron bell had not yet rung, and she had already heard what the Alpha's household steward had said about her. She had not been meant to hear it. She had been standing near the covered wagon, waiting for the outriders to sort out some tangle with the luggage, and the steward had been speaking to one of the keep's senior wolves not 20 feet away, his voice carrying with the particular carelessness of a man who never troubled himself to consider who might be listening. "Forgettable," he had said. That was the word. Lord Calder's first choice fell through, and now we're getting the forgettable one from the Ashmore line. The Alpha won't even look at her twice. She had stood very still. She had a talent for stillness. It was one of the few things her father had ever praised in her, and only because it made her easier to ignore at dinner. She had kept her face smooth and her hands loose at her sides, and she had breathed through the sting of it until it became something she could carry. And then she had made a decision. She was gone before the iron bell rang. Not dramatically, not in the middle of the ceremony, not in a blaze of wounded pride. She had simply turned, while the outriders were still arguing, and the steward was still talking, and no one was watching the plain, forgettable daughter of Lord Ashmore, and she had walked into the village market with the calm certainty of a woman retrieving something she had left there. She had kept walking past the market, past the miller's cottage, past the edge of the road, and into the tree line, where the forest swallowed sound, and she had stood there for a long time, breathing pine resin and cold air, letting herself think. The thinking had not gone particularly well, because the thinking had led her here, not back down the mountain road toward home, which would have meant another 3 days of travel, and the particular look on her father's face when he discovered she had embarrassed him, and not into the forest, which she had considered for approximately 4 minutes before her practical nature reasserted itself. The forest in the northern ranges was not a place you walked into without preparation, and she had packed for a wedding, not a survival situation. Instead, the thinking had led her to a small stone building at the edge of the village, separate from the others, with a healer's knot carved above the door. She had knocked. An old woman had answered, and looked at her for a long, assessing moment, and then had said, without preamble, "You have a steady hand, and you're not squeamish. I can tell by how you're standing." That was how Mara had spent her first night in Ashvale, not in the Alpha's keep, but in the village healer's cottage, learning to strip willow bark and sort dried herbs into the correct clay jars, while old Brea talked at her, in a steady, unsentimental stream, about which plants grew on which slopes, and why it mattered that you harvested chamomile in the morning and not the afternoon. She had not gone back, not that first day, and not the second, and by the third she was sleeping on a cot behind the dispensary, and the village had begun to absorb her, the way villages absorb useful people, quietly, practically, without ceremony. She set bones. She learned to identify the particular smell of a wound that was turning bad. She helped deliver a set of twins in a farmhouse, 2 miles up the slope, during a rain that turned the track to mud, and came home soaked through, and oddly, unsettlingly content. The iron bell at the keep had rung, eventually, on the evening of the day she had walked away. She had heard it from the forest edge. She had not been there to hear her own absence announced, but she imagined it had been brief and not particularly mournful, the forgettable one from the Ashmore line. They had probably moved on within the hour. That had been 6 weeks ago. She was thinking about it now, not for the first time, as she carried a basket of clean bandages up the village's main track in the early morning, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. The reason she was thinking about it now, specifically, was that a group of riders had come down from the keep the previous evening, and old Brea had told her in that flat, informational way of hers that they were asking questions about a woman matching Mara's description. "You could leave," Brea had said, in the same tone she used to describe the properties of feverfew. Mara had said nothing for a while, sorting the herbs that didn't need sorting, and then she had said, no. She wasn't entirely sure why. It was not courage exactly. It was more that something had taken root in her, in these 6 weeks, something she hadn't expected, a sense of herself as a person who was useful, who moved through a day and left evidence of having been there. The twins she had helped bring into the world were alive, and had been named, she had heard, one of them partially after old Brea, and the other after a grandmother. She had set the blacksmith's son's broken wrist, and watched him flex his fingers 2 weeks later, with an expression of amazed relief. The village had begun to nod to her in the mornings. 3 different women had stopped her on the track to ask questions, quiet questions, with a particular kind of urgency to them, the questions women asked when they needed information they couldn't get from a man or a priest. She was, she realized, not forgettable here. That was the thing. That was the particular thorn she kept pressing against when she tried to reason herself into leaving. She turned onto the side track that led to the east side of the village, where a woodcutter's family had a child with a persistent cough, and she was so occupied with the basket and the track and the thinking that she didn't see the horse until it was nearly on top of her. No, not nearly. It had stopped a careful distance away. She simply hadn't been paying attention, and the horse was very still and very large, and the man on its back was looking down at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. He was not in the livery of the keep's household riders. He wore a dark wool traveling cloak, practical and plain, and he sat the horse the way men sat horses when they had been riding since before they could walk, which was to say without appearing to think about it at all. His face was, she took stock of it quickly and practically, the way Brea had taught her to take stock of a patient, angular, weathered at the edges, dark eyes set under a straight brow, a jaw that suggested he was either exhausted or very deliberately not showing what he was feeling. He said, "You're the healer's apprentice they call Mara." He did not ask it as a question. She adjusted the basket on her arm and looked up at him steadily. "I'm the healer," she said. "Brea is retired, more or less." Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. It was less like a door opening and more like someone adjusting the weight on a set of scales. He said, "I have a message from the keep." She said, "I'm busy." He said, "It's from the Alpha." She kept walking. He turned the horse and followed her at a walk, which she found irritating, and also, in some part of her she was not ready to examine, somewhat satisfying. She said, without turning, "If the Alpha wishes to speak with me about my absence from my own wedding, he can come down the mountain and say what he has to say in person. I won't be receiving messages from intermediaries." There was a silence. Then he said, "It's not about the wedding." She stopped. She turned around. He had also stopped, and the horse was looking at her, with a brown eye that conveyed nothing useful. She studied the man, and he studied her back, and she noticed that his hands on the reins were not entirely steady, which was the kind of detail that mattered when you were trying to assess a situation. She said, "What is it about?" He said, "The Alpha is sick." The silence stretched between them, cold and significant. She said, because she was practical. "How sick?" He said, "Sick enough that Aldrich rode down here himself at dawn to ask a woman who walked away from her own wedding if she would come and look at him." She looked at him for a moment longer. She said, "You're Aldrich." He didn't answer, which was an answer. She shifted the basket again. She said, "I have to see the woodcutter's child first. The cough won't wait. You can come or you can wait. Either way, I'll be an hour." He came. He dismounted and led the horse, and walked behind her at a respectful distance, and she noticed that he didn't speak unless she addressed him, and didn't watch her in the way men sometimes watched women, appraisingly, cataloging. He simply walked, and when they arrived at the woodcutter's cottage and the family dog came out to investigate, he went very still and let the dog smell his hand, and the dog's tail began to wag, almost immediately, which she filed away as significant. She examined the child, a girl of 7 with bright eyes and a bark-like cough that had gone on 11 days, which was too long, and decided on a steam preparation with pine oil and eucalyptus, and a recommendation that the child sleep sitting up for the next week. The mother asked sharp, intelligent questions, and Mara answered them all. The father hovered in the doorway, looking helpless, in the way fathers of sick children look helpless, and she told him specifically what he could do. Stack additional firewood close. Keep the room warm, but not stifling. Make sure the child drank broth every few hours, because men like that needed a task, or the helplessness curdled into something worse. When she came out, Aldrich was sitting on the stone fence, with the horse's reins looped loosely through his hand, looking out over the village with an expression that was harder to read than his earlier ones. The rising sun had reached the rooftops and was turning the frost on the thatch to silver. It was, objectively, beautiful, and she noticed that he seemed to be actually looking at it, rather than waiting for her, with the elaborate, studied patience of a man who thought patience was a performance. She said, "She'll be fine. What does the alpha present with?" He looked at her. He said, "Fever. Weakness. He can't shift." She felt the gravity of that statement land in the correct place inside her. A wolf who couldn't shift. There were several causes, some manageable and some very much not. She said, "How long?" He said, 4 days. She said, "And you waited 4 days?" He said, with a flatness that she recognized as the cousin of shame. He refused to send for anyone the first 2 days. The 3rd day, he agreed to send for the pack healer, who came and looked at him and said it was a punishment from the ancestors for taking a destined mate from another pack. The 4th day, Aldrich woke up at dawn and rode down the mountain. She heard the way he said his own name, 3rd person, as if he were reporting the actions of someone he was mildly exasperated with. She said, "And what do you think it is?" He said, "I think he's been poisoned." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because the pack healer has been taking his meals with the Betas faction for the last 3 months, and the Betas faction has a compelling interest in seeing the Alpha unable to function. But I have no proof of that. I only have a feeling, and feelings don't move the council." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "Take me to him." She gathered what she needed from Brea's cottage. The old woman watched her pack with bright eyes that missed nothing and said nothing, except, "Take the black tin, not the green one." She took the black tin. The ride up the mountain took the better part of 2 hours. She rode Aldrich's horse, and he walked beside it, which she objected to, and he ignored, and she eventually stopped objecting, because the track was narrow in places, and the horse was calm and sure-footed, and she could use the time to think. The mountain forest pressed close on both sides, old-growth pine and silver birch, the undergrowth still holding the last of the season's frost in the shadows. She heard wolves at one point, somewhere in the trees, 3 distinct voices calling back and forth across the distance, and the horse didn't startle. She watched Aldrich tip his head slightly, the way she had seen dogs tip their heads to listen, and something in his posture eased. She said, "Your wolves?" He said, "2 of them, and one who isn't mine, exactly, but runs with us in cold months." She said, "Can you understand them?" He said, "Not words, but, yes, more or less." He said this with the particular mix of comfort and self-consciousness that people used when admitting to something true and slightly vulnerable, and she found she had to look at the track ahead to avoid softening toward him too noticeably. She said, "What are they saying?" He said, roughly, "That there's a woman on the mountain who smells like pine and willow bark and doesn't seem frightened. They find it interesting." She said, "I'm not frightened." He said, "No, I noticed that." She looked down at him then, because there was something in the way he said it, not surprised, not appraising, but careful, as though he were noting a fact he intended to keep, and she found his face tilted up toward her at the same moment, and the eye contact was brief, but it had weight to it, the specific weight of two people who have both noticed something and are both being quiet about it. She looked away first, not out of shyness, out of the recognition that the mountain was steep, and she had a sick man to assess, and this was not the moment for whatever that had been. The keep was larger than it had appeared from the valley, not because it was showy, but because it was practical, built for defense and winter, and the long centuries between both. The outer walls were black granite, worn smooth by weather. The inner courtyard was well maintained, swept stone and functional buildings, no aesthetic decoration except for the iron gate, which was, she paused, looking at it, actually beautiful, worked into the shapes of running wolves and winter trees, with the kind of skill that meant someone had once cared very much about it, and the tradition of caring had been maintained. She noticed 3 people watching her arrival from different vantage points. She noted their positions without appearing to. Aldrich said, quietly, as he helped her dismount, "The woman near the well is the beta's sister. Don't tell her anything." She had not needed to be told that. She had seen women like that, the precise quality of stillness in them, the particular angle of watching. She had grown up in a house full of politics, and she was better at reading rooms than anyone had ever given her credit for. She said, equally quiet. Understood. He led her inside. The keep smelled of stone and wood smoke, and beneath that, something she placed after a moment, as the particular animal warmth of wolves, not unpleasant, dense and alive. The corridors were lit by iron sconces, and the floors were old stone covered in well-beaten rugs, and she noticed that the walls held weapons, functional weapons, not decorative, mounted for access not display, and also, to her mild surprise, books, not many. A shelf here, a stack there, but present. She filed that away too. The Alpha's chamber was on the 3rd level, at the end of a corridor that had 2 men outside it, whom Aldrich acknowledged with a look. They stepped aside. He opened the door. The smell hit her first, the specific smell she had been dreading, which was the smell of fever sweat that had gone on long enough to have changed character. She set her basket down, rolled up her sleeves, and went to the bed. He was not what she had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say what she had expected. He was large. She had known that. The Ashmore match had been presented to her in terms of his status and power, and she had assumed something large and loud, but the largeness was not intimidating in the way she had braced for, because he was genuinely ill, and illness had stripped away whatever usual authority he projected, and left someone who was simply a man in a bed, sweating through his sheets, with dark shadows under his eyes, and a jaw that needed attention, and a quality of effort about each breath that she didn't like. His name was Kalen. She had known that. She had been told she was to marry Kalen Ashvale, Alpha of the Northern Ranges, and she had formed a theoretical understanding of a name attached to a position, and now the name and the position were a sick man in a bed with a cracked lip and a fever that she would put at 1.5 degrees above where it should be, not catastrophically high, but high enough, and climbing. He opened his eyes when she sat at the edge of the bed, and they were dark and very clear for a man running a fever, which she noted as either a good sign or a complicating factor. He said, with a hoarseness that had been there a while, "You're the healer." She said, "Yes." He said, "You're also." She said, "Yes." He looked at her for a moment with those clear, dark eyes. She looked back at him with her professional attention divided between his coloring and the quality of his breathing and the way he was holding his arms. He said, with a faint dryness that fever hadn't quite eliminated, "I owe you an apology." She said, "Let me look at you first, and apologize later." He said, "Aldrich said you were practical." She said, "Aldrich was accurate." She worked for the better part of an hour. She checked what she needed to check with the practiced briskness she had developed in 6 weeks of learning, that when you hesitated in your professional capacity, people lost confidence in you, and when people lost confidence in you, they stopped telling you important things. She asked questions, and he answered them, short and direct, which she appreciated. Aldrich sat in a chair by the door and didn't interfere, which she appreciated more. When she had finished, she sat back and looked at her hands and thought about what she had found. She said, "What do you eat for breakfast?" He said, "Grain porridge and venison, when there is it." "The usual," she said. "Who prepares it?" A pause. He said, "The kitchen. A girl named Fen, recently." She said, "Recently." He said, "She replaced the woman who'd been doing it for years. Senna was, the beta recommended Fen, 2 months ago." She looked at Aldrich. He was very still. She said, "I need to see the kitchen." She also needed the black tin from her basket, which Brea had packed with a specific preparation that Mara had not entirely understood the purpose of until now. It was a binding compound. It worked by seeking out and immobilizing the metabolites of 3 particular nightbloom-derived substances, which were the 3 most common tools of the slow poison trade in the northern ranges. Because nightbloom grew readily in the highland forests, and the knowledge of its preparations was old and widespread. The nightbloom family did not kill quickly. It accumulated. It worked on the shifting mechanism in wolves first, because that particular neurological pathway was the most sensitive, the most finely balanced, before working its way into the deeper systems. Which was why Kalen couldn't shift. Which was why his fever had a slightly wrong quality to it. It was not a fighting fever. It was a suppression fever. The body trying to process something it had been receiving in small amounts for weeks. She found what she needed in the kitchen without much difficulty, once she knew what she was looking for. Aldrich stood in the doorway of the kitchen while she worked, and said nothing. The kitchen girl, Fen, 16, with the specific miserable expression of someone who had been told something was harmless, that they had begun to suspect was not, started crying before Mara said anything at all, which made Mara's chest ache with a complicated mixture of anger and sorrow for the girl, and the determination not to let either of those things interfere with what needed doing. She said, "I'm not here to punish you. I need to know exactly what you've been putting in the morning porridge, and where you got it, and who told you to." Fen said, through the crying, "They said it was a sleep aid. They said he worked too hard and needed to rest more, and it would help him sleep, and it wasn't enough to hurt anyone. They said it was only a small amount." Mara said, "How long?" Fen said, 8 weeks. 8 weeks. She ran the numbers. 8 weeks of small amounts of nightbloom oil in a grown wolf's food would not have killed him by this point. The slow accumulation hadn't reached the critical threshold, but another month or 2 would have begun to affect his heart, and 3 months beyond that she didn't want to think about. She said, "Who told you?" Fen gave a name. It was not the beta's name, but it was a woman in the beta's household, and that was enough to establish the shape of the thing, even if proof remained the problem Aldrich had named it. She went back to Kalen's chamber. She compounded the binding treatment with the black tin, and a carrier she made from heated oil, and 3 things from her own basket. And she sat on the edge of the bed and explained what she was doing and why, with the same directness she would have used for anyone, and she watched his face change as he understood the extent of what had been done to him, watched the particular quality of a strong person processing the knowledge that they had been systematically undermined, the brief flatness before something hardened and resolved. She said, "This will take the edge off the fever by tonight. You'll need to take the compound every morning and evening for 2 weeks, and nothing should go into your food that doesn't come through a chain I give you. You should be able to shift again within 5 days, 7 at the most." He said, "And the person who did this?" She said, "That's not my department." He said, "No, it isn't." He looked at Aldrich. Something passed between them. She stayed the night because the fever needed to be monitored, and because Brea's cottage was 2 hours down the mountain, and she was not going back in the dark. They put her in a room with a real bed, a fire that someone built up to a respectable size, and a tray of food that Aldrich stood over in the kitchen and supervised the preparation of personally, from ingredients he selected himself, which she found both appropriate and quietly touching. She sat in the chair by the fire, after checking on Kalen one last time, and ate her dinner, and thought about what she was doing here, and where here was, and whether she had made a decision, or whether a decision had been made around her, the way currents move around a stone, without asking the stone's permission. She was still sitting by the fire when she heard the knock. She said, "Come in," Kalen said, from the doorway, holding himself upright with the specific deliberateness of a man who was still sick, and very determined not to show it. "I want to talk to you." She said, "You should be in bed." He said, "I've been in bed for 4 days." She said, "And you'll be worse by morning if you stand in cold corridors." He said, "Then invite me to sit by your fire." She looked at him for a moment. She gestured to the other chair. He crossed the room with that deliberate care and sat down, and she watched the way the effort cost him and the way he arranged himself so the cost was not visible, and she thought, "I know that particular kind of pride." It was familiar to her, the way a word is familiar, that you've always known but never had occasion to use. He said, "I need to apologize for what my steward said in the village." She said, "I don't need an apology for that." He said, "I need to give one anyway. What he said was wrong, and he said it carelessly, and in my name, and I knew, I had been told, that you could hear. I should have addressed it before you left." She stopped. She said, "You knew I could hear." He said, "Someone told me. Afterward. After the bell." She said, "And before the bell?" He said, "Before the bell I was—" He stopped. He said, with a flatness that was the same cousin to shame she had heard in Aldrich's voice, "I was in the courtyard when they were readying for the ceremony, and I heard what he said, and I didn't correct him in the moment. I want to be honest with you about that." The fire crackled. She sat with that for a moment. She said, "Why not?" He said, "Because I was angry, not at you, at the situation, at the arrangement, at—" His jaw set. He said, "It had been presented to me as a solution." His voice had the careful flatness of someone delivering a version of events they had rehearsed, but not fully made peace with. "I was told my first choice had withdrawn. I was told you were the available alternative from the Ashmore line. The word my steward used, forgettable. I didn't say it, but when he said it, I didn't refute it immediately, and that was a failure." She said, "It was." He looked at her directly. He said, "Yes, it was." Something in the quality of the silence changed. Not warmer, exactly. More honest. She said, "For what it's worth, I don't know if I would have stayed even if you had refuted it. The decision to leave wasn't only about what your steward said." He said, "I know. What was it about?" She said, "It was about—" She thought about how to say it accurately. About not entering a house as a forgettable thing. About deciding that if I was going to be somewhere, I was going to be there as something real, and not as an arrangement that was announced in the same breath as its own inadequacy. He was quiet for a while. He said, "That's fair." She said, "Yes." He said, 6 weeks. She said, 6 weeks. He said, "You delivered twins and set a broken wrist, and diagnosed my poisoning. In 6 weeks." She said, "Brea is an excellent teacher." He said, with something that was not quite a smile, but inhabited the same neighborhood, "You already knew how to look at people. That's not teachable." She felt the warmth of that settle somewhere she had not expected to be warm that evening. She said, "Go back to bed, Kalen. The compound needs time to work." He stood. He moved toward the door, and then stopped, and said, without turning, "I would like to speak more, when I'm not a man who had to hold the doorframe to walk into a room." She said, "You can speak more when you're well." He said, "And if I ask you not to leave before then?" She sat with that question. She said, "I'll stay until you're well. After that is a different question." He turned then, and looked at her across the room, and the firelight was between them, and she thought about the quality of what she had felt walking into this keep for the first time. The cold and the humiliation, and the decision, and she thought about the 6 weeks on the other side of that decision, and she thought about twins and willow bark, and the particular smell of pine at dawn, when the frost was still on the trees. She said, "Go rest." He went. She stayed by the fire a long time after. and the thinking was more complicated than it had been in the forest, 6 weeks ago, but it was also more genuinely hers. The next 2 days had a rhythm to them that she hadn't anticipated, and found herself adapting to without much argument. She checked on Kalen in the mornings and evenings, administered the compound, monitored his fever, and spent the hours between those appointments in a way that, she gradually realized, was being arranged for her by Aldrich with the subtle efficiency of a man who had decided a thing and was seeing to it without fanfare. On the first day, there appeared, in the room she had been given, a set of shelves and several of the reference texts on Northern Highland herbalism that were better than anything Brea had. On the second day she was asked, by Aldrich, with the careful neutrality of someone who would have presented a written request if he'd thought it would help, whether she would be willing to look at 2 other members of the household who had been unwell and hadn't wanted to bother anyone. She said yes. She looked at them. One had a straightforward respiratory ailment she treated with steam and rest, and one had an infected splinter in his palm that had been there so long she marveled it hadn't gone further before he'd mentioned it, and she dealt with both matters with the same practical directness she'd developed over 6 weeks, and left both men with clear instructions, and the look she had also developed, which communicated without words that she would be checking on their compliance. Aldrich watched her do this from the doorway of the second man's room, and when she came out he said, without particular inflection, "You've been doing this 6 weeks." She said, "I've been doing this all my life. It just had a different shape before." He looked at her. He said, "Kalen asked me to tell you that he'll be in the Great Hall at noon if you want to walk through." She said, "He's supposed to be resting." Aldrich said, "He's been resting for 2 days. He's going to tear the bed apart at this rate." She went to the Great Hall at noon. The keep's Great Hall was... She stood at the entrance and took it in for a moment before entering. It was lit by high windows that were letting in the kind of mountain winter light that was pale and clean, and the hall itself was organized along practical lines, the tables set for use, rather than display. But someone had built up the main fire until it was genuinely warm, and the air in the hall smelled of wood smoke and bread and something savory from the kitchen. 3 of the keep's wolves were at one end of the hall, doing something that involved a map spread on a table. They looked up when she entered, and looked away again, which was a kind of respect she recognized. Kalen was standing by the fire. He was dressed, which was an improvement over the last 2 days, and he was standing without the doorframe assistance, which was a better improvement. He turned when she came in, and she did her automatic assessment. Color better, posture more natural, the deliberate quality of effort less pronounced, and felt something settle in her chest that was part professional satisfaction and part something she was still deciding whether to name. He said, "You look like you're calculating something." She said, "I'm calculating that you're about 20% less likely to be dying than you were 2 days ago." He said, "That's the most reassuring thing anyone has said to me this week." She said, "It's a low bar." They walked. Not a formal tour, not a guided presentation. They simply moved through the hall and then through a corridor she hadn't been in, and he talked about the keep the way you talked about a place that had formed you, with the specific mixture of pride and exasperation of someone who had inherited something that was both beautiful and burdensome. She asked questions that were sometimes about the stonework and sometimes about the people, and she noticed that when she asked about people, his answers were longer. He said, "The map they're working on is a pasture boundary dispute that's been going 3 seasons. 2 families, both with valid claims, neither willing to give way. I've been trying to find a resolution that doesn't leave either of them feeling cheated." She said, "What's the nature of the claims?" He said, "One family has a document. One family has a well." She said, "Who uses the well?" He said, "Both of them, in practice." She said, "Then both families own the land jointly, and the well is the shared infrastructure that makes the joint ownership legible. Make it a formal shared title, with water rights specifically defined, and the pasture season divided." He stopped walking. He looked at her. He said, "That's..." She said, "It's what Brea does with the herb plots." Some of the village families had boundary disputes over gathering rights for years. She turned 3 of the disputed plots into formally shared commons with specific harvest calendars. and the disputes stopped. The principal transfers, he said, slowly. Yes, it does. He was looking at her with an expression that was the same set of scales adjustment she had seen on the horse that first morning, the same quality of recalibration, except it was larger this time, covering more of his face. She said, "Don't look at me like that." He said, "Like what?" She said, "Like you're surprised." He said, "I'm not surprised, I'm—" He considered the word, recalibrating. She said, "From forgettable to not." He said, with a directness that she hadn't fully anticipated, "From a name attached to an arrangement to a person I would very much like to keep talking to. Yes." The fire from the hall was not quite reaching this corridor, but there was a wall torch and it was enough to see by, and she was aware of the warmth of the space between them and the way he was standing, which was close, but not encroaching, which was the same quality of consideration she had been noticing since the first morning on the mountain track. The way he occupied space near her with attention, but not pressure. She said, "I told you I would stay until you were well." He said, "I remember." She said, "I also said after that was a different question." He said, "I remember that too." She said, "I'm still not sure what the answer to the different question is." He said, "Then I have some time to present my case." She looked at him in the torchlight, this man who was more than the position he occupied, and more interesting than the arrangement he had initially been to her. This man who had been systematically undermined by people in his own house, and was processing that fact with a controlled steadiness that she recognized as real rather than performed. She said, "You have some time." She went back to Brea's cottage on the 4th day to collect more supplies and check on her patients in the village. She expected to go alone, and found that a horse had been saddled for her, a smaller horse than Aldrich's, steady and good-tempered, and that Aldrich himself was apparently going to accompany her, not because he had been sent, but because, he said, without any particular elaboration, he was going that direction anyway. She said, "You're going to visit the healer's cottage at the edge of the village." He said, "Old Brea sometimes needs firewood split." She said, "Does she ask you to split it?" He said, "She doesn't not ask." They rode down the mountain in the morning light. The frost was heavy on the trees, and the wolves she had heard on the way up were not present in the forest today. But she caught sight of a lone white wolf on a ridge above the track, very still, watching them pass with what seemed like interested calm, and Aldrich lifted a hand toward it, in a gesture that was not quite a wave, and not quite a salute, but something in between. She said, "Who is that?" He said, "Her name is Winter. She's not pack exactly. She runs with us, and has since I was young. She shows up when something is happening, and disappears when it isn't." She said, "She's watching us." He said, "She's watching you. She'll have smelled you on the mountain. She's making up her mind." She said, "About what?" He said, "Whether you belong here." She looked up at the ridge. The white wolf held perfectly still for another moment, then turned and disappeared into the tree line, with a fluid ease that made her chest tighten with something she could only describe as awe. The animal's beauty was stark and absolute, white against gray sky, and then it was gone. She said, "And what do you think?" He said, after a pause that was honest rather than hesitant, "I think you already know what I think." She did, actually. She had the evidence. She thought about the shelves in her room, and the herbalism texts, and the kitchen supervision, and the horse already saddled, and she thought that Aldrich was the kind of person who conducted his loyalties through logistics rather than declarations, which was a language she read clearly, because it was her own language too. She said, "I think Winter might be right to take her time." He said, "She always does." They arrived at the village. Brea came to the door before they had dismounted, and looked at Mara with the same assessing brightness, and said, "Fever's broken then." She said, "How did you know?" Brea said, "Because you're walking like yourself. You were walking like a problem when you left." She saw her patience. The woodcutter's daughter was much improved, sitting up in bed, and demanding to know when she could go outside, which Mara told her was an excellent sign, and also Not yet. The blacksmith's son showed her his healed wrist, with the pride of a boy who has conquered something. Two women came to the back door of Brea's cottage, with their careful, quiet questions, and she sat with them, and gave them what she had, that was useful, which was information delivered with the respect of someone who understood that the questions themselves had cost something. Brea watched all of this with her bright eyes, and said nothing, until Aldrich was outside, and they were alone. And then she said, "What are you going to do?" Mara said, "I don't know yet." Brea said, "You know. You just haven't decided to say it." She didn't answer for a moment. She was rolling bandages with the automatic efficiency of 6 weeks of practice. She said, "I walked away from an arrangement. I don't want to walk back toward one." Brea said, "What makes you think it's still an arrangement?" "Look," she said, "I don't know what it is yet." Brea said, "That's different from thinking it's an arrangement." She tied the bandage. She said, "He's an alpha who had his position undermined for months by people in his own house, and didn't know. I don't know what that does to a man's judgment." Brea said, "You know exactly what it does. You watched it for 2 days. You watched it, and you decided it didn't change your assessment." She said, "I don't know what my assessment is." Brea gave her the particular look that Brea used for people who were being deliberately obstructive. She said, "Go back up the mountain, girl. You have unfinished business." She went back up the mountain. On the 5th day, Kaylin shifted. She was in the room with the good herbalism texts when she heard it. Not the shift itself, but the sound that followed. A sound she had not heard before, low and resonant, somewhere between a note and a breath, and it vibrated in her chest in a way that she understood was the wolf's voice. Not threatening, something closer to relief. She put down the book and went to the window that faced the inner courtyard, and he was there. The wolf was there, very large, black-gray, moving with a looseness that said every joint was glad to be moving again. He crossed the courtyard once, and then twice, and then he sat in the exact center of it and looked up at her window with eyes that were the same dark and clear as his human ones, and she thought, well. She stood at the window for what was probably longer than she should have, and the wolf sat in the courtyard, and neither of them were pretending anything. On the 6th day, Kaylin was himself again, or rather, more accurately, he was the version of himself that illness had been suppressing, and that version turned out to be somewhat more than she had been working with. He was sharper and more energetic, and he laughed twice in one conversation, which she had not heard before, and the laugh was a good laugh, real and unperformed, the kind that arrived before the person decided to produce it. The matter of the Beta's household had moved forward quietly, in the way these things moved in a functioning pack, not a council meeting, and not a public accusation, but a series of conversations that she was not party to, and didn't ask about, and the kitchen girl Fen was quietly reassigned to tasks where she was being directly supervised by people Aldrich trusted, and 2 members of the Beta's household staff appeared to have developed sudden pressing reasons to visit relatives at a considerable distance. The Beta himself was still present, and still posturing, and still the problem that couldn't be addressed without proof, but the immediate threat had been neutralized, and Kaylin was on his feet, and the balance had shifted, and she could see by the way the keep's wolves moved around him that they knew it. On the evening of the 6th day, Kaylin came to find her. She was in the small south-facing room that had somehow, over 6 days, accumulated her basket and her books and her tin and 3 different preparations, drying on the windowsill, and she was aware that it had accumulated these things and that she had let it happen. He knocked. He sat across from her when she gestured to the chair. He said, "I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to tell me directly if the answer is no." She said, "All right." He said, "I would like to court you, properly, not as an arrangement, and not as a match, and not as any of the things this started as. I would like to learn who you are, with the attention it deserves, and I would like you to know who I am, and if at the end of that knowing, you decide to go back to Brea's cottage, and do exactly what you've been doing for 6 weeks, I'll help you get there safely, and I won't make it into something it isn't, but I want to ask." She sat with that. The fire was going, and the preparations on the windowsill smelled of chamomile and pine, and the cold mountain air coming through the gap in the shutter she'd opened for ventilation. She said, "You understand that I'm not the same person who was announced in the village square 6 weeks ago." He said, "I don't think you were that person 6 weeks ago either. I think that's been the point of this entire conversation." She said, "The Pack Council will have opinions about whether the alpha courting the woman who walked away from the Iron Bell is appropriate." He said, "The Pack Council has opinions about everything. I've been managing the Pack Council for 11 years. She said, "Your beta, specifically, will have opinions." He said, "My beta is going to be fully occupied with the consequences of the choices his household made for the foreseeable future. I'm not particularly concerned about his opinions at this moment." She said, "And what do you know about me?" "Actually, 6 days." He said, "I know you assess situations before you walk into them. I know you're direct about things that matter, and quiet about things that don't. I know you told Fen she wasn't in trouble before you asked her any questions, which was both strategically wise and genuinely kind, and you probably didn't separate those two things in the doing of it. I know you stood at the window in the courtyard yesterday, for longer than you needed to. I know you haven't brought this conversation to an end yet." She looked at him. He said, with the straightforwardness she realized, beginning to rely on, "I know I want to know more than that." She said, "I'd like you to know more than that." The warmth between them was not the warmth of the fire, though the fire was there. It was something more particular, more specific, to the two people sitting across from each other in a stone room, at the edge of a mountain winter, two people who had come to this through an indignity and a decision and a fever and a white wolf on a ridge, and who were now, without ceremony, agreeing to begin. She said, "The Pack Council will not be the only difficulty." He said, "No." She said, "My father will have things to say about my being here, outside of the formal agreement. He will call it irregular. He will be embarrassed." He said, "Your father's embarrassment is your father's problem." She said, "He'll make it mine." He said, "He can try. He'll find it's harder than he expects." He looked at her steadily. "You've been living on a mountain for 6 weeks, and healing people who needed it, and deciding what you are, without asking his permission. I don't think that's a woman who's easily made to carry another person's embarrassment." She said, "I walked away from my own wedding." He said, "Yes, because you'd been told you were forgettable, and you refused to accept it. On someone else's terms, in someone else's house, before the ink was dry." He paused. "I find that—" He seemed to consider whether to say the next part, and then said it. "I find that remarkable. I think it was the right thing to do, and I think it cost you something to do it, and I think you did it anyway." She said, "It cost me a great deal." He said, "I know, and I'm sorry that my household was the vehicle of that cost, and I'm asking you whether you're willing to find out if something worth keeping can come out of a thing that started wrong." The fire crackled. The chamomile on the windowsill stirred slightly in the draft. She said, "Yes." And that was the beginning of the real thing, which was not an arrangement, and not a ceremony, and not anything that had been announced in a village square or measured against the ringing of an iron bell. It was a conversation that continued over the following days and then weeks, conducted in the way conversations are conducted when two people are genuinely interested in each other, interrupted by real life, deepened by crisis, occasionally derailed by disagreement, and then resumed, and each resumption more substantive than the one before. She stayed. Not because she had been asked to stay, exactly, though she had been asked, but because she had found the specific thing she had gone looking for in Brea's cottage, the evidence of herself as a person who was present and real and necessary, and she had found it larger here than she had expected, not just in the medical work, though the medical work was real and she was good at it. In the conversations with Kaylin that ranged across the pasture dispute and the Pack Council dynamics and the history of the keep and the history of her own family and the question of what it meant to lead people who were both human and something older and more instinctual than human, a question she had been thinking about, in one form or another, her entire life, without ever having the vocabulary for it. In the way Aldrich became, over those weeks, something she could only describe as a friend, not the formal friendship of people thrown together by circumstance, but the real kind, built from the accumulation of small moments where one person sees another clearly and says nothing but reflects it back. In the way the keep began to know her, and she began to know the keep. The white wolf appeared twice more in those weeks, once on a ridge above the track when she was coming back from the village, and once in the inner courtyard at dusk, sitting in roughly the same spot Kalen had occupied after his first shift, regarding the east wing of the keep with an expression that conveyed, to Mara's reading, something like considered approval. She told Kalen about it, and he said, with that good laugh arriving again, "Winter is the pack's oldest memory. She doesn't come inside for anything, except the very significant." She said, "The significant being." He said, "That's usually how you tell what matters." The matter of the beta broke open in the third week, not because of the poisoning, they still didn't have the proof that moved councils, but because of a financial irregularity that Aldrich had found by going through 10 years of ledgers with a patience that she found admirable and quietly terrifying. And the beta's position in the pack structure was not ended, but was dramatically altered in a way that removed his ability to maneuver through the council unimpeded, and two of his key household allies withdrew their proximity to him with the smooth speed of people correctly reading which direction things were moving. Kalen told her about it in the great hall the evening it was settled. He looked tired in the way that wasn't illness, but was the weight of having managed a complicated thing through to its conclusion, and she sat across from him, and he explained the mechanics of what had happened and what would follow, and she listened and asked the questions she had, and didn't soften the harder ones, and he answered them all straight. She said at the end, "You're relieved." He said, "Yes." She said, "Not just about the beta." He said, "No, not just about the beta." He looked at her. "There's a version of this where I spent the last 3 weeks trying to prove something to you, and I wasn't sure whether I was proving it. Yes, relieved." She said, "I know what you are. I've known for 2 weeks. I've been thinking about the rest of it." He said, "The rest of it." She said, "What this means going forward, what it means for the pack, and for me, and for the things I've started with Brea, and with the village. What it means for," she was honest about the harder parts, "what it means for what I am here, and whether I can be that thing clearly, without it being subordinated to whatever the council thinks the alpha's chosen mate ought to be." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "What are you afraid of?" "Exactly." She said, "I'm afraid of being forgettable again, but this time by choice, because it would be easier." He said, "I don't think you're capable of making yourself forgettable. I think you've been trying for years and it hasn't taken." She said, "That's not entirely reassuring." He said, "It's not meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be accurate." He leaned forward slightly. Let me say this plainly. I want a mate, not a reflection. I want someone who thinks things I haven't thought, and says them plainly, and makes me better at the things that matter, and argues with me when I'm wrong, and I want that specific quality of clarity that I have now gotten very addicted to in 3 weeks of watching you work. I don't want decorative agreement. I've had enough of that." She looked at him across the firelit table, and thought about the cold on the first morning, and the iron bell, and the forest, and the twins, and Brea's voice, saying, "Go back up the mountain, girl. You have unfinished business." She said, "I want a place that's mine, to have built, not given." He said, "Then build it." She said, "You'd have to let that be messy sometimes." He said, "I think I can manage messy." She said, "And the council?" He said, "Mara." She stopped. He said, simply, "I would like you to stay. As yourself. All of what yourself is, including the parts that walked away from an iron bell, and spent 6 weeks healing children in a village, and walked back up a mountain, because it was the right problem to solve. That's the person I'm asking." She was quiet, for a long moment. She said, "Yes." And that yes was larger than the first one, and carried more weight, and was also more certain. It was the yes of someone who had thought the whole thing through, and arrived at it by their own path, and recognized it when they got there. The formal matter of the bond was handled without the particular pageantry that had been planned for the original announcement, which suited them both. There was a ceremony attended by the pack, and conducted under the winter sky in the courtyard, where she had watched the wolf cross and recross after his first shift, and she stood in her own wool dress, that was dark blue, and good quality, and entirely her choice, and Kaelin stood beside her, looking like himself, and Aldrich stood behind him, looking like a man who had known this was going to happen before either of them did, and was trying not to be visible about how satisfied he was by this. The white wolf appeared on the wall above the courtyard gate during the ceremony. She saw it the moment she walked out, and she almost smiled, and then did smile, because there was no reason not to. Brea came up from the village for the ceremony, traveling in a cart driven by the woodcutter, whose daughter had recovered fully, and was now apparently the most enthusiastic woodfetcher in the family, and had taken to following Brea around, asking questions about plants. Brea stood in the crowd, with the same bright, assessing eyes, and said nothing for the duration of the ceremony, and said everything she needed to say by being there. Mara's father sent a letter. It was 3 paragraphs of what she had expected, and 1 sentence at the end that surprised her. A sentence that said simply, in a cramped hand that spoke of having written and rewritten it several times, "Your mother would have been proud of you." She read that sentence 4 times, and then put the letter away in the black tin from Brea's bag, where she kept the things that mattered. The keep changed and didn't change. The basics of its life continued. The council met and disputed and was managed. The pasture boundary was resolved along the lines she had suggested, and both families were eventually grudgingly satisfied. The pack ran on the mountain at the full moon, and she watched them from the high window in a way that was not separate from what they were doing, but adjacent to it, her own kind of watching. The east wing of the keep became, over the course of the winter, something that was genuinely a healer's space, not Brea's cottage transplanted, but its own thing, shaped by what was needed here, by the specific population of a keep and its surrounding villages. She went to the village regularly and kept those connections alive because they were hers, and they mattered, and because she had built them herself. Brea, who was nominally retired, showed up at the keep's east wing on 2 separate occasions to correct her on the preparation of a Highland tincture, and stayed both times for dinner, and argued amicably with the keep's cook about the best method for preserving rosehip, which was the most entertaining thing Mara had watched all winter. Kaelin learned over time that she worked best when she had space, and told him directly when she needed it, which was a communication style he received well, because it was also his own. They disagreed about 3 things of substance in the first 3 months, with varying degrees of heat, and resolved all 3, and the resolution of each disagreement made the next conversation slightly easier, and she thought that was what good things were, not the absence of friction, but the accumulated practice of returning to each other through it. She was in the east wing in the early spring, sorting the new season's first harvest from the lower slopes, when Aldrich came in and stood in the doorway, with the expression he used for things he was trying to be neutral about. She said, without looking up, "What is it?" He said, "There's a delegation from the Ashmore line in the outer courtyard." She said, "Which members?" He said, "Your father and your brother, and 2 advisors." She set down the chamomile. She dusted her hands. She said, "Give me 10 minutes, and then bring them to the hall." She paused. "Tell Kaelin first." He said, "He already knows." She looked at her hands for a moment, at the stain of herbs on her fingers, and the practical roughness of working hands, and the simple iron ring that was the bond marker of a northern pack, and not decorative in any way. She thought about the cold in stone halls, and the smell of tallow and old rushes, and the moment 6 weeks before her life had actually started, when she had heard herself called forgettable, and had decided, quietly and practically, that she was not going to be. She thought about what she was now, in this place she had built. She went to the great hall. Her father stood in the entrance, with the particular posture of a man who had come to deliver a speech, and was finding that the room was not arranged in the way he had expected. Kaelin was already there, which her father had not anticipated, and Kalen was standing at ease by the fire, with the quality of presence he had, that was not aggressive but was entirely unambiguous, and Aldrich was in the doorway behind her father, with the quality of presence he had, that was slightly more pointed. Her father saw her, and the speech shifted behind his eyes. She was not what he had sent here, the reliable, quiet, forgettable daughter who would manage her emotions and smooth things over. She was, apparently, something else, and he was adjusting to that, with the particular facial reorganization of a man whose categories were being reorganized without his consent. She said, evenly, "Father, you should have sent word ahead. I would have made sure there was a proper reception." He said, "We were in the area." They were not in the area. The Ashmore estate was a 3-day journey. She let that pass. She said, "Come in, we'll have dinner." The dinner was, by any objective measure, awkward. Her father had come with a specific object. She read it clearly. The reclamation of some authority over the situation. The implication that her departure from the original arrangement had created irregularities that required discussion. The general posture of a man who had ceded something he hadn't meant to cede and wanted it back. None of that object was legible against the reality of the dinner, which was that she sat at the right side of the alpha of the northern ranges and passed him the bread in the way you passed bread, to someone you had been passing bread to for months and would pass bread to indefinitely, and her brother, who was more genuinely curious than politically motivated and had always been her favorite member of the family, spent most of the dinner asking Kalen detailed questions about Pack territorial law that Kalen answered with the patience of a man who did not mind the questions. Her father made his speech after the meal, in the great hall, with the fire and the wall-mounted weapons as witnesses, and she listened to it with her hands folded and her face pleasant, and let him finish, before she said, "I understand what you're saying. I would like to tell you what I'm choosing." He said, "Mara," she said, "I'm not resentful of you. I want to say that first." She meant it, and he could hear that she meant it, which was the more disarming thing. "I know the arrangement was made in good faith, and I know my departure was complicated for you. I'm choosing to stay here because it is mine, in a way that was mine to make it, and because the person I am here is the person I have always been, and this is the first house I've lived in where that was sufficient." She paused. "I am glad you came. I hope you'll come again, properly, when we can show you the valley in good weather. But the question of what my life is here is settled." Her father looked at her for a long time. Then he said something she had never heard from him in exactly that tone. "You are entirely your mother." She said, "I know." He left in the morning with his brother and his advisors, and when he left, something settled in her that she identified, after a moment of attending to it, as the particular release of having stood where she stood, in front of someone whose opinion of her had once been the weather system she lived inside, and having stood there without needing the weather to change. Aldrich brought her tea afterward, which she hadn't asked for, and set it on her work table, and left without comment, which was its own kind of fluency. The spring opened the mountain. The snow retreated up toward the peaks, and the lower slopes filled in with green, and she expanded her collection circuits to include the new growth, and began to learn the seasonal geography of the place, in the way you learned it by walking it, by following the same tracks in different lights, by arriving at the same clearing a week apart and seeing it entirely changed. She and Talon walked the lower boundary of the Pack territory on a long afternoon in late spring, just the two of them, no household business attached, and she asked him to tell her the names of things, the names the Pack had for the different sections of forest, the names of the prominent rock formations, the old names that weren't on any map. He told her, and she stored them, and he noticed her storing them, and said, "You're going to remember all of that." She said, "I remember everything. It's not a skill, it's a burden, mostly." She paused. "The ridge above the track has 2 names." He said, "The day name and the night name." "Yes, different things happen there, at different times." She said, "What's the night name for?" He said, "There's a stone on the ridge that's been warm since before my grandfather's grandfather. Pack legend says, it marks where something was settled, a very long time ago. You go there at night, when you have something to settle, and you put your hand on the stone, and you say what it is, and then it's settled. She said, "That's," she considered the word, "beautiful." He said, "I haven't been up there in years." She said, "Why not?" He said, "There wasn't anything I needed to settle." He looked at her sideways. "For a while," she said, "and now," he said, "now everything that needed settling has been settled." He took her hand as he said this, which was uncalculated and immediate, and she let him keep it, and they walked the rest of the boundary like that, with the spring forest pressing in on both sides, and the wolves somewhere in the trees running the new grass, and the mountain above them holding the sky, with the particular permanence of mountains that have held many skies and would hold many more. She thought about the cold in the keep on the first morning, and the smell of tallow and old rushes, and what had come after. She thought about the iron bell that had rung into her absence, and the shape of the thing her absence had created. She thought about the word forgettable, which she turned over occasionally, the way you turned over a river stone to see what lived under it, not with pain anymore, but with the intellectual interest of a person who had learned something significant from an unlikely source. The thing she had learned was this: the word forgettable had been a map in the wrong direction, toward a version of herself that didn't exist. She had followed it away from the keep, and in following it away had arrived, by the specific logic of her own choices, at the actual place she was meant to be, which was not the logic anyone had intended, not her father's, not the steward's, not the original arrangements, only hers. You couldn't plan that. You could only move through the cold with your eyes open, and your hands ready, and your practical intelligence applied to each thing as it presented itself, and trust that the sum of those choices would build something that was genuinely yours, and not a forgettable approximation of someone else's arrangement. Kaylin said, interrupting the thinking, because he was good at knowing when she was 3 thoughts deep in something. "What are you working out?" She said, "I'm working out that I'm glad my father's first choice fell through." He said, after a pause that held several things she was not going to ask him to name right now, "Yes, I've been working that out too." They came back from the boundary in the early evening, and the keep was lit up against the approaching dark, the fires in the windows turning the stone warm, and the smell coming down the track was wood smoke, and the first herbs of the season, and something from the kitchen that meant someone had caught fish in the river, and the great gate with its worked wolves and winter trees was standing open, the way it stood open in the evenings, when everyone who was coming home had come home. She walked through the gate. She walked through it the way she had first walked through it, through the cold, into whatever came next. But the cold was different now, familiar, not threatening, the kind of cold that meant she knew where the fires were, and the smell was not old and strange and mineral, but was her mountain, and her keep, and the place she had built out of a word that had been meant to dismiss her, and had instead, in the end, turned out to be the first sentence of an entirely different story.